Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. History had always been my strong suit. That was the only reason I pursued archaeology in the first place. There was something fascinating about unearthing the past, seeing how civilization had grown, how far we had come. 9 years. That's how long I'd dedicated to chasing my PhD, sweating through dig sites, cataloging fragments of lost worlds, and enduring endless grant applications. It had been worth it. At least that's what I told myself. I had multiple awards to my name, even some so-called treasures uncovered in the dirt. But in reality, it wasn't as glamorous as people thought. There were two sides in my field. Those who believed in evolution, and those convinced everything was placed here by God. I had always been on the side of science. I had never believed in God, or so I thought. I was home for the first time in years, visiting my parents, finally allowing myself a real break. A week of peace, away from government budget cuts and rich donors who saw funding us as an ego boost rather than a genuine investment in history. The truth was, most of archaeology was red tape and dead ends. Hours of preparation for weeks of digging, just to find nothing. Or worse, to have a meaningful discovery taken away. Maybe that's why I ignored my work phone when it buzzed. I saw the screen light up from across the room, but I didn't move. They knew I was on break. Whatever was buried beneath the earth could wait a few weeks. I pushed away the guilt and sat at the dinner table with my parents, letting myself enjoy a normal evening for once. Mom and Dad were talking about some game show they had been watching before dinner, laughing about some contestants' ridiculous answers. It was nice, comfortable. Then our phones buzzed in unison. It was so perfectly timed that my stomach twisted. I glanced at my phone. The screen was red. The text was white. Emergency alert. Do not go through the gate. I blinked. What gate? Dad stood abruptly, already reaching for the remote. The TV flickered on, and what should have been the normal broadcast had been interrupted. A red emergency ticker looped across the bottom of the screen, repeating the same message from our phones. But the footage was something else entirely. The first shots were from helicopters and drones. Some were filmed from buildings or long-range cameras. Each one showed the same thing. Gates. Massive golden gates, rising at random locations across the world. Each one at least 60 feet tall, their pillars thick and ancient-looking, carved with intricate engravings. They had forced themselves out of the ground, shattering concrete, cracking open the streets, breaking through forests, fields, and highways. They were closed, their ornate metalwork glimmering under the camera lights, but what lay beyond them was wrong. You were supposed to see the other side, the street, the buildings, the trees, but instead there was only sky. Golden and pink clouds swirled behind the gates, like a sunset frozen in time. Then, the broadcast cut to live footage, and I felt my breath hitch. A man stood in front of one of the gates. The gates were sealed shut, but the gaps between the bars were just wide enough for someone to squeeze through. And he did. He slipped between the metal, stepping forward into the golden mist. And then, he was gone. No resistance, no delay, no transition, just gone. A chill crawled up my spine. I was still staring at the screen when my work phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an alert, it was a text. Professor Higgins, my boss. Melissa, call me back. Now. I stood from the table so fast my chair scraped against the floor. Without a word to my parents, I stepped into the hallway and hit dial. He answered before the first ring had even finished. They're picking you up in 30 minutes. Be ready. Then, the line went dead. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, stomach knotting with something I didn't want to name. When I turned back to the dining room, my parents were already looking at me. Dad still stood by the TV, his jaw tight. Mom's hands were folded in her lap, fingers clenched together. They knew. They didn't ask anything. I didn't explain. I just turned and walked upstairs, shoving all my clothes back into the small carry-on bag I had barely unpacked. I zipped it closed and hurried downstairs. And when I reached the front door, someone was already waiting for me. Dad stood in the doorway, speaking quietly to a man in a military uniform. I swallowed hard. The man turned toward me. His face was sharp, weathered but young. "Dr. Mayfield?" he asked. His voice was steady, but something about his posture was too rigid. I nodded. "I'm Officer Jax. I'll be taking you to the base." He gestured toward the black SUV parked outside. I turned back toward my parents, the words slipping from my mouth before I could stop them. "Don't go near the gates," Mom nodded. Dad gave me one last long look. Then I stepped outside. The SUV door slammed shut behind me, and just like that, I was gone. The ride to the base was silent. Officer Jax didn't speak, and I didn't ask questions. The hum of the SUV's engine filled the air, interrupted only by the occasional crackle of his radio. Each time it did, a muffled voice rattled off coordinates, brief updates, and phrases like, "Another one appeared, confirmed location, Madrid. Perimeter secured, no civilian breaches, no return attempts, still missing." I gripped my bag tighter. The drive stretched on, and I noticed something unsettling. The roads were empty. It wasn't that late. There should have been cars, people, life. But instead, the city was eerily still, as if everyone had retreated indoors at the first sign of the alert. Or maybe they had already left. The thought sat heavy in my chest. By the time we reached the military base, the night air had turned sharp and cold. The gates opened for us immediately. Soldiers posted on either side, their faces unreadable. Jax parked the SUV and stepped out. "This way." I followed him past a series of tents, the glow of overhead floodlights washing everything in a harsh artificial white. People moved with purpose, soldiers and researchers alike, their voices low but urgent. At the heart of the base stood the main tent. And inside, Professor Higgins. He stood at the far end of the tent, hunched over a massive table, papers, maps, and photographs scattered before him. His hair was a little grayer than I remembered, but his sharp, calculating eyes hadn't changed. He barely looked up before saying, "Melissa?" Finally. I stepped closer. "I hope you know what's going on." I nodded, glancing at the large world map pinned to the table. Red circles marked locations all over the globe. Dozens. Hundreds. Each one indicating where a gate had appeared. I swallowed hard. "Is this all of them?" Higgins shook his head. "No, they're still being discovered. More are being called in every minute." A chill ran down my spine. I exhaled sharply. "So I'm here because..." His eyes met mine. "You're here to help me. We're near one." The words settled over me like a weight. Higgins gestured to the map. "The military has sealed it off, 5-mile radius, no civilians, no media, no interruptions." I nodded slowly, even though I already knew the answer. They needed me for this. Higgins straightened, his gaze shifting around the room. There were at least 15 of us gathered here. Researchers, scientists, military personnel, all waiting for instructions. His voice carried across the tent. "We're leaving in 10 minutes. I want the military to stay back and let me and Dr. Mayfield do our job." "Understood?" A collective nod. I noticed Officer Jax standing at the edge of the room. He caught my eye, offering a weak smile. I didn't smile back. Now wasn't the time. Higgins handed me a backpack, already pre-packed, heavy, full of gear I didn't even need to check. "We've got a 10-minute ride to the gates," he said. "Use it to study these." He handed me a stack of photos. I flipped through them, my breath catching as I saw them up close for the first time. The pillars were covered in glyphs, dozens, hundreds, layered over one another, twisting and curling into intricate patterns. Some I recognized, others I didn't. "Here," Higgins said, pointing at one in particular. "This is why I needed you." My stomach tightened. The symbol he pointed to, it was Mayan, a shape strikingly similar to the engravings we had uncovered in Mexico 2 summers ago. "You see it, don't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, and just like that, I knew. Whatever these gates were, they weren't new. They had been here before. The ride to the gates was tense. No one spoke. The hum of the military transport filled the silence, the occasional crackle of radio chatter cutting through. The road was dark, the floodlights from the base shrinking behind us until we were swallowed by the emptiness of the secured zone. I gripped the stack of photographs in my lap, flipping through them again. The more I looked at the engravings, the more uneasy I felt. The glyphs were unmistakable. Mayan, Egyptian, Aztec, even Mesopotamian symbols, all layered together. Different civilizations, separated by centuries, somehow connected by these impossible structures. It didn't make sense. Higgins sat across from me, arms crossed, eyes closed, as if deep in thought. But I knew better. He was just as disturbed as I was. The SUV lurched to a stop. "We're here," Jax muttered. The doors opened, and the warm night air rushed in. I stepped out, the distant floodlights casting long shadows across the perimeter. And there they were. The gates. They loomed before us, taller than I imagined. A solid 60 feet of golden metal, their pillars cracked through the earth like they had forced their way out of the ground. It should have been nighttime. But behind the gates, it wasn't. Through the bars, the world was frozen in a golden sunset. The clouds drifted in soft pink and gold, stretching endlessly into the horizon. And the heat, it wasn't unbearable, but it was unnatural. A warmth that didn't belong here. Higgins and I stepped closer, the rest of the team staying back. The military perimeter had been set 5 miles out, but here, only a handful of soldiers were positioned, watching, waiting. Jax followed us, staying a few paces behind. Higgins raised a hand, stopping me before I could step any closer. He reached out first, fingers grazing the surface of the golden pillar. Nothing happened. I swallowed hard, then did the same. The metal was warm, not hot, just alive. A faint burning scent drifted from the other side, like charred wood mixed with something I couldn't place. We spent the entire night working. Higgins took detailed notes. We photographed every engraving. We tried deciphering patterns, but the sheer volume of overlapping glyphs made it nearly impossible. At some point, Higgins even tried to push the gates open. Nothing happened. By the time the sky began to lighten, we had taken hundreds, maybe thousands of photos. It was time to return. Back at the base, I took a quick shower, changed into clean clothes, and returned to the main tent, where Higgins was already sorting through the photos. We worked in silence. Hours blurred together as we sifted through the evidence, analyzing symbols, looking for any connection. And then, a gunshot. A single, deafening bang from the tent next to ours. Higgins and I froze. Then we ran. Inside, Jax stood, his hand still clutching his gun, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. And on the ground, a man, dead. A knife was still clutched in his stiffening fingers. I looked back at Jax, his face was pale, his chest heaving. "He tried to attack me," he muttered, voice hollow. No one spoke. Jax took a shaking breath and dropped his gun. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the nearest chair, pressing his hands against his face. He said he had to go in. His voice cracked. He said the gate was calling him. A heavy silence settled over the tent. Higgins stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "And when you told him no?" Jax exhaled shakily. "He pulled a knife." I turned back to the body. The man's grip on the blade was tight, his knuckles white. Jax wasn't lying. The room felt colder suddenly, despite the warmth still clinging to my skin from the gate. Higgins squared his shoulders. "From now on, no one is allowed near the gate alone." No one argued, because at that moment, we all knew something was very, very wrong. The base was different after the shooting. The tension that had already existed had sharpened into something worse. No one said it, but we all knew. That man hadn't lost his mind. Something had called him. And now, everyone was waiting, watching each other for signs of the same madness. The body was removed. Jax hadn't been punished, not officially. It was self-defense, and everyone agreed. But he hadn't spoken much since. He just sat in silence like he was waiting for something. I tried to focus on the photos. I buried myself in them, trying to analyze patterns, cross-reference the glyphs, find meaning in the chaos. But Higgins was changing. At first, it was subtle. He became more irritable, snapping at people for no reason. He stared at the same photographs for hours, hands twitching, eyes unblinking, and then he started muttering. I caught him whispering under his breath, repeating words that didn't make sense. At first, I thought he was just exhausted. We all were. But when I got closer, I realized he was repeating the same symbols, over and over, the ones from the gates. That night, he stormed into the tent and slammed his hands onto the table. We missed something. I looked up from my work. His eyes were bloodshot, his breathing too quick. "We have to go back." I frowned. "Higgins, we already—" "No." His hands curled into fists. "There's something we didn't see." A chill ran down my spine. Because his voice? It didn't sound like him. I had worked with Professor Higgins for years. I had seen him excited, angry, exhausted, but never like this. I opened my mouth to argue. But then the decision was already made. The military escort was ready. The vehicle was waiting. The higher-ups had approved it. And before I knew it, we were in the car, heading back to the gates. The moment we arrived, Higgins moved first, not like a man walking toward a dig site, like a man being pulled. I stepped out of the SUV just in time to see him bolt forward, sprinting across the dirt, straight for the gate. Higgins! I ran after him, Jax right behind me. Higgins wasn't thinking, he wasn't measuring or analyzing, he just ran. Straight for the gap in the bars, straight for the golden mist. Jax caught his arm first. I grabbed him second, my fingers curling around his wrist. I dug my heels into the ground, pulling with everything I had. He was so close, too close, and then he slipped through my fingers. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, vanished into the golden clouds. I stumbled back, heart hammering. Jax was breathing hard beside me, hands trembling. For a moment neither of us moved. Then a sound, a deep, rumbling groan. I turned, dread curling in my stomach. The gates, they were moving. The massive golden doors began to creak open, slow and heavy. The sunset behind them shifted. The pink and gold clouds were gone. Now, it was daylight, but there was no sun, no source of light, just blinding brightness flooding through the widening gap. And the heat rushed forward, crashing against us like a wave. But it wasn't just warm, it was hot. Jax took a step forward, eyes wide. I grabbed his arm, my grip iron tight. "Don't you dare." He turned to look at me, and behind us, the rest of the military personnel started walking toward the gate, one by one. Silent, calm, unstoppable. Jax and I tried to stop them. We shoved them, yelled at them, dragged them back. But then, one of the men whipped around. His eyes were wild, and he screamed in Jax's face, "He is waiting for us, and for you too." Jax stumbled back. I froze, and then he turned to me. His face relaxed, his body went slack. And then Jax started walking too. And before I even understood what was happening, he grabbed my hand and pulled me forward toward the gate. Jax's grip was iron tight. I struggled. I tried to resist, but I didn't really want to. Not anymore. With every step forward, the fight inside me faded. The logic, the fear, the desperate need to escape, it all felt so small. The heat was getting stronger now, wrapping around me, sinking into my skin, filling my lungs like thick golden air. It should have hurt, it should have burned, but instead, it felt good. Like I was supposed to be here. I wasn't alone either. The soldiers, the researchers, the people we had come with, they were all walking now, silent, steady, their eyes locked on the gates. And Jax was leading me. His hand was wrapped around mine, and I couldn't let go. I didn't want to. I glanced up at him, and for the first time, he finally spoke. His voice was so gentle. "He's waiting for you too, Melissa." And suddenly, I understood. The air shimmered ahead, thick waves of heat distorting the horizon. The golden glow was gone now, replaced by something else. The clouds, they were burning, not like a normal fire. No, something deeper, something older. It moved slowly, deliberately, flames twisting in endless spirals across a sky that didn't need a sun. And it was so beautiful. I think I was crying, not out of fear, not out of pain, but because I finally saw it. I finally understood. I let Jax pull me forward, step after step. The ground beneath my feet wasn't solid anymore. It rippled, like sand in the desert beneath a sweltering sun. And then, the heat slammed into me. Real heat, not warmth, not comfort. Fire. It ripped through my body, peeling away my skin, my clothes, everything that wasn't me. And I welcomed it, because it felt so good. The light consumed me, the world lurched, and I collapsed to the ground. My hands hit something rough, something that wasn't there before. Jax's hand, it was gone. I turned, and that's when I saw him. Jax lay just a couple of feet back, his body, or what was left of it, skin gone, flesh peeled back, burned away, leaving behind scorched muscle and gleaming bone. His uniform was in tatters, his arms frozen mid-reach, like he had tried to crawl away at the last second. But his face was peaceful, like he was just asleep. I should have been horrified. I should have been screaming, but I wasn't. Instead, I smiled, tears welled in my eyes, my vision blurring, because this place, it was so warm. It was so beautiful. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. Had I tripped, or had my legs just melted away? It didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. I just lay there, staring up at the burning clouds. And then I realized I wasn't alone. There were others. I could feel them all around me, stretching beyond the horizon. A sea of bodies, broken and burned but whole, happy. This wasn't a trap. This was a passage to him, for all of us. And maybe, for you too. You should come, I'll save you a spot.